can't hear your voice, Benedict.
We're in the third chapter of Sukkah. We're learning about the lulav and the various species that make up the lulav. And we've covered so far the hadas, the arava, and the lulav itself. And now we're going to go to the etrog. But before we go to the etrog, we're just going to take a second to talk about quantities. Rabbi Yishmael Omer Shlosha Hadasim Ushte Aravot Lulav Echad ve'etrog Echad. Rabbi Yishmael said 3 hadasim, 2 aravot, 1 lulav, and 1 etrog. And we recognize these quantities actually from our practice today. And the Rambam comments that the halacha goes according to Rabbi Yishmael, and as we'll see in a minute, according to Rabbi Tarfon as well. Rabbi Yishmael goes on to say, Afilu shnaim ketumim ve'echad enu katum. Rabbi Yishmael said, look, if 2 have their tips broken and 1 is whole. And he seems to be talking about the hadas here, because there are 3. And Rabbi Tarfon is going to come along and make things even easier for us. Rabbi Tarfon omer afilu shloshtan ketumim, even if all 3 have their tips broken off. And that's effectively, that's the halacha according to Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Tarfon. And Rabbi Yishmael, I think, is going to learn all of these out from the verses. Rabbi Akiva has a different view. Rabbi Akiva omer kashem shelulav echad ve'etrog echad kach hadas echad v'arava echad. So Rabbi Akiva will say, look, there's only 1 lulav and 1 etrog, so to only 1 hadas and 1 arava. The sages learn the fact that the aravot have to be plural, again from the pasuk, and we looked at the pasukim yesterday. The pasuk says, ve'arvei nachal. You shall take Arvei Nachal, the willows of the brook. Arvei Nachal is in the plural. So the Talmud deduces that there has to be some plurality. So that's at least 2. And in terms of the myrtle is Etz Avot, this branch of a thick tree. And the leaves have a sort of plaited pattern that cover the trunk, and the 3 of the myrtle seems to be connected to the fact that the leaves are sort of plaited around the trunk, and of course a plait requires 3. But this is all, it's, I wouldn't say halakha Moshe Sinai, but these are all ancient traditions. Rabbi Ishmael is active in the time of the Beit Mikdash. We don't really understand where these traditions come from, but we have these traditions. What about the etrog? Well, the Mishnah is going to give us exactly the same introduction to the etrog as it did to the other elements of the 4 species. Etrog hagazul v'hiarbesh pasul. An etrog which is stolen or which is dry is invalid, just as we learned about the other 3 species. And we said yesterday that this is nothing to do with ownership. This is nothing to do with dealing with an etrog that you don't own. It's something to do with mitzvah haba ba'avera. It's a mitzvah which you fulfill with a transgression. It's all about means and ends. And somehow, if the means you're using are invalid, then you haven't got to the end. And it's a powerful moral lesson even today, that we can't, if we set out in the wrong way, we can't expect to get to the end. But having established, just like the other species, that if the etrog is stolen or withered, it's invalid, we then get a whole list of other disqualifications, which are related to the fact that the etrog is edible. The etrog is the only one of the 4 species which is edible. So we're going to say shel asherah v'shel iradachat pasul, from an asherah or from a condemned city is invalid. Well, we know that. But then we go on to issues related to food. Shel orla pasul. Orla is food which is fruit which is picked from the first 3 years of a tree's growth, or perhaps the fourth year. In the fourth year, the fruit has to be brought to Jerusalem. And the rabbis have a view that when we're talking about a fruit, we're talking about and the pasuk says, Peri Eitz Hadar, the fruit of the beautiful tree, or maybe the beautiful fruit of the tree. Something is beautiful, either the fruit or the tree, but the operative word is fruit. It has to be a fruit that we can eat. And a fruit which is orla, which is in the first 3 or 4 years, can't be eaten. So the etrog is pasul. Shel truma tmeah pasul. What about truma, which has gone unclean? Well, we can't eat that. We have to burn unclean truma. Pasul. Shel truma Torah. Interesting. What about clean truma? The halacha is lo yitol ve'im natal kasher. He really shouldn't take it, but if he does take it, it's kasher. The rabbis are anxious that we can take an etrog from clean truma, but we're going to use it. We're going to shake it for 7 days. What if we make that etrog unclean? Maybe we're going to handle it in such a way, or wet it, or make it susceptible to impurity. And maybe it will end up impure at the end of the week. And of course, we can't put food into a position where it becomes, if it's truma and it becomes impure, right? We can't be used. So we can't take truma and put it into a position where it might become impure. So that's why the halacha is lo yitol. In principle, don't do it. But im natal kasher, because look, in principle, clean truma is edible. What about demai? Demai is food that has been bought from someone who is not reliable in taking tithes. So we don't really know whether this food's been tithed or not. We are, by the way, just doing a quick run through all of the halachot of Zeraim, really, in this tiny Mishnah. So what about demai? Shel demai beit Shammai poslinu beit Hillel machshirin. If it's demai, beit Shammai says it's invalid, but beit Hillel says kasher. Now, of course, poor people are allowed to eat demai. Rich people aren't. So again, we can see the rich-poor split between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel coming out here. We know that Beit Hillel famously are a bit more forgiving to the poor. And the Gemara says, look, in principle, anybody could become poor. And the example given in the Gemara is that they might renounce their possessions. But look, we know, and of course, this is Sukkot, right? It's Sukkot. We're reminding ourselves about how temporary our possessions are. So anybody could become poor. And that's why the halacha follows Beit Hillel. And, if anybody could become poor, in principle, anybody could perhaps eat an etrog that's demai, and therefore it's fit for eating. So it's fit for use in the 4 species. Shel Ma'aser Sheni B'Yerushalayim. What if it's second tithe? And we're presuming here it's second tithe in Jerusalem. Shel Ma'aser Sheni B'Yerushalayim. Because second tithe outside Jerusalem, I think there'd be no question you can't eat it. Second tithe has to be brought to Jerusalem. No question that you could possibly use it. And again, halacha is lo yitol ve'im natal kasher. In principle, it shouldn't be taken. But look, if he took it, it's valid. And I think the same reason as the Gemara gives for clean truma, that it's possible that by taking it, we're going to render it impure. And we don't want to take, if it's food that's got to be eaten in Jerusalem, we don't want to have the possibility that we render it impure. What about the etrog itself? And look, and I thought it would help if I just brought a picture of the etrog. This one comes from Steinsaltz's Talmud. It's very nice and labeled, and you can see the pitam on the top, and that is a sort of nose-like thing that grows on top of an etrog, and the oketz on the bottom. And the oketz is the bit that ties it to the tree before it's picked. And the Mishnah is going to mention these parts, but it's going to begin with something called a chazazit. Alta chazazit al rubo, if a rash spread out on most of it. This is on most of the etrog, by the way. So we're still in the etrog. Alta chazazit al rubo, if a rash spread out on most of it, or nidla pitmato, or if its pitum is taken off. So the pitum is the bit at the top here. If the pitum is taken off, niklaf, nistak, nikav v'chaser kol shehu pasul. So it's peeled, it's split, it's nikav is perforated, someone stuck a hole in it. V'chaser kol shehu, any part of it is missing, it's invalid. And I think we're going back here to this idea that the etrog has to be beautiful. It's pre-eitz hadar. It's either the fruit of a beautiful tree or it's a beautiful fruit. So we don't want some. We don't want some kind of some. It doesn't. We don't want it damaged. What's the chazazit? Well, I brought you Jastro here. Jastro says the chazazit is lichen. Lichen is lichen. It's like mushroom, but he defines it as a cutaneous disease connected with desquamation and sometimes ulceration. It's some fungus which is growing on top of the etrog. And if most of it has got this fungus, al tachazazit al rubo, it's pasul. If the rash has spread out on most of it, it's invalid. But if it's only on a minor part, we can lighten up a bit. Al tachazazit al miuto. If a rash spread out on some part of it, less than half of it, nital ukso. If the oketz was missing, that's the stem at the bottom. It's perforated, but no part of it's really missing. Kasher. So we can deal with minor imperfections here. Etrog hakushi pasul, an Ethiopian etrog is invalid. This seems to refer to a black etrog. The word kushi seems to refer to a black etrog. V'hayarok kucharti. What about an etrog which is as green as a leek? And we see these today in the markets. Rabbi Meir machshir v'Rabbi Yehuda posel. Rabbi Yehuda declares it invalid. And of course, today we do see, certainly in the markets in Israel, some etrogim which are green. And we see even some etrogim that don't have a piton. But this is not a piton that's been, it's not that their piton's been broken off. Is that they never had a piton.